Hi, welcome to another Austin Software Cooperatives. This is our July meetup. Today, we are going to continue with the reading material Jackson Rising. This is about the cooperative Jackson. We're going to be focused on people's assemblies, and we're going to jump back into the mind map that we started in the last review. If you want to see more about that, go check out on our YouTube channel. And Watson, are you ready to jump back in?
Sure.
On people's assemblies. Thanks.
All right. So there were a few chapters that were recommended, and as far as on the people's assembly, or actually recommended reading within the book by Kali, the author, and chapter 20 actually was the one that he recommended on the People's Assembly, but chapter 5 and 13 are also an overlap on some of the information there. So if people went over any of those, feel free to jump in. The thing about chapter 20, it's called Casting Shadows. It gives an overview of the use of the People's Assembly within the context of Jackson, Mississippi, within the plan that they had there. So are there, before I start, are there any questions or anybody that took a look at People's Assemblies, anything that jumps out at them that they want to talk about before we even get into the book? Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and get in here. So the Jackson Initiative, they call it the Jackson Kush Plan here. Let me go ahead and make this a bit bigger. And it had three components. Some of this is review from the previous book review that we did on chapter 1. The building people's assemblies is one component, building an independent political force and building a solidarity economy. So that was the Jackson Kush Plan. Now, I really like this chapter because it gives the argument for the strong positions that they take by starting off with a contextualization. Right. So the first portion is called Contextualizing the Initiative, Poverty, Prisons, and Paternalism. So move this down here. All right. So there are three components with Jackson, Mississippi, and Mississippi in general that create this need for something different than the traditional, I'm going to vote for my mayor and then we'll have the outcomes that we want, that we're all used to. So the first one is paternalistic capitalism, and took an excerpt here. So paternalist capitalism shifted how Black labor was exploited from the original, let's say the 1800s and 1700s. Following the collapse of the short-lived Reconstruction period, the government in Mississippi, the Black workers were primarily confined to being sharecroppers, which is farm laborers who worked almost exclusively for the large landowners who were their former owners and their descendants. They were wholly dependent on the large landowners for their wages, food and shelter, and medical care. And so the sharecroppers were slaves by another name. If you want to put another note in here, if you want to have a good biography of someone that was a Black sharecropper, There's a book called The Same Kind of Different as Me by Ron Hall. And they were a sharecropper all the way into 90s, the 90s, but the description of their life is very much that of a slave. They didn't know that they didn't make any wages at all, and they were they at the end of the year they had to pay back their they had to pay for the house and the land that they were using with the crops that they produced on the land. So they made very little or no money. They basically made no money. They would owe money at the end of the year to the landowner, and they weren't able to read. And this was just part of their family and their generations of how they live until within this story until their house burned down, and then they had to leave that sharecropping area, and they found out, oh wow, there's a whole different world out here. So that's an important thing, I think, for for that specific part, Jackson, Mississippi, and the history of how they're exploited there. So then you have poverty. So Mississippi is the poorest state in the union with a median income of $37,000, one of the poorest cities in the U.S. The poverty rate at 28%, and official unemployment at 8%, but the real unemployment at 25%. And you have prisons. So Mississippi is one of the most repressive states, third highest incarceration rate. Let's see what else here. So here's an interesting thing that has to do with cooperatives in the definition that we use, which is basically kind of removing the employer-employee relationship and basically keeping almost everything else the same. Within Mississippi and Jackson, the author's argument is that it's a weak link in the existing dominant system. So because the dominant system relies so much on white supremacy, essentially, which is reviewed. We reviewed in our last book review last month. It's actually a weakness because it's so easy to point out the overt gentrification that's happening, the laws that were, or legislation that was being passed that had nothing to do with people, the majority that lived in the city. It's easy to point out that, oh, okay, the system that is in place actually is not serving the people that are there, even through the idea of free markets, so on and so forth. It didn't work. So the answer is to have all of these different organizational movements and different business structures, and trying to use those to get around the oppression. So is there any questions so far? All right, we're going to get into the People's Assembly now. So that's the driver for a big component of what they're doing over there. So the People's Assembly allows the practice of democracy, and this entails making direct decisions that are political, so contractual, electoral, and legislative, but also economic, social, and cultural within the community. And there's different configurations of a People's Assembly, but generally a People's Assembly is a mass gathering assembled to address essential social issues that are pertinent to a community. And they define a body as a mass body when it engages at least 1/5 of the total population in the geographic area. So it may be some things that might jump out. I mean, to jump out to me, jump out maybe to some others is, it seems like maybe something like a town hall, or another question would be like, why would you even do some other assembly when you can just vote? And they address some of those questions later on. All right. Let's go here. So here's a type of people's assembly. A constituent assembly is a representative body that is dependent on a mass outreach, but is structured intentionally or unintentionally to accommodate the material and social obstacles to participation, such as having to work, caring for children, lacking access to information, and political or ideological differences. The challenge with that type of assembly is it tends to become overly bureaucratic and stagnant. So another term for some of these is a special interest, right? So that's one type. A mass assembly is a pure example of a people's democracy. It normally emerges during times of acute crisis. So a mass assembly is this 1/5 situation, and the constituent assembly is representative. Yeah, one kind of problem with the representative type is sometimes the representatives don't actually represent the people. So this 1/5 number, the author is saying this is kind of a magic number for the to have a good participation. Is there any questions so far? Okay. Assembly is an event where we deliberate on general questions and issues and decide on what can be done to address them. Assembly is a process where the various committees and working groups refine the more detailed questions of goals, strategies, and timelines. The Assembly as an institution is a product of the combined social weight of the Assembly's events and processes, as well as its actions and outcome. Right. So basically, they were saying here that the Assembly can be thought of as an event, as a process, or as an institution. So that's what that definition was about. For the author and for Jackson Cooperation or Cooperative Jackson specifically, the driving forces of an assembly should be able to clearly distinguish between acting as a counter-hegemonic force during stable and pre-revolutionary periods and acting as a hegemonic force during revolutionary periods, distinguishing between acts of positioning, such as building allies, and acts of maneuvering, such as open confrontation. I found that to be, this is kind of some of what someone might say is like the militant part of the movement there. And it's interesting the way the need for something that might seem extreme or might seem combative, and then what is actually produced in order to implement the ideas, right? So saying that, using terms like revolutionary and hegemonic force and things like that, I tend to use the term like hierarchy when we're talking about, in places where you should be able to have a democratic process and have some type of representation or say into the decision-making process, and then saying that there's a hegemonic force is kind of saying, oh no, you're not able to have that say in the decision-making process. So it kind of relates well to cooperatives outside of, like, they use cooperatives as well, but they're saying you need to use democracy as in every part of your movement. But strategy also, for me, it's interesting to see where the rubber meets the road when it comes to trying to take a flat group that doesn't have a hierarchy and trying to make strategic decisions against the real opponent, which for them they describe, the multiple different opponents, but one of them is the governor of Mississippi. How do you do that? And saying that, okay, there are actually different periods. There are periods when you need to be building allies, and the People's Assembly is a tool to do that. And it needs to be able to distinguish between that period and periods such as open confrontation, which could be, okay, we're going to try to create a vote against the governor or other things. They have numerous things that they do that are against the initiatives of the governor there. So are there any questions so far? Does anybody, what jumps out to people as far as the People's Assembly that, does it seem like the same thing as just any other type of group that gets together to you? Or is this new? Does this seem like just a rebranding? What does it seem like to you?
I think a lot of it for me is the difference in language, how they're speaking about it. When you come down to the reasons and everything, then it starts making sense. But the language, I see Jeff, you're raising your hand. Go ahead.
I am raising my hand. Yeah, I was just going to say that, so I've been involved in sort of Latin American left solidarity for a long time. So the idea of participatory democracy is not strange to me, but in the US it's pretty strange. We don't really think about things like go on in Brazil, where they have participatory budgeting, where local folks actually get together and say, what are we going to do? What we call democracy a lot of times here is you just go every 4 years and vote for Tweedledee or Tweedledum. Those are your only choices, and that's it. Then you go home and you don't bother with it anymore. So what they're talking about here is a much more profound involvement in governance and the world we live in.
That's exactly right. So do you see anything differently, that's different about the People's Assembly versus just any other type of assembly? They made a distinction here between a constituent assembly and a mass assembly. It seems like they did that for a reason. Like it seems like they like the mass assembly more. They're kind of saying that this constituent assembly, well, use that if you can't. It seems like use that if you can't get the participation, the 1/5. Have you ever heard of this kind of, for the people who are going to be affected, 1/5 of them should be part. You're aiming for 1/5 of them to be part or participate in the gathering. You ever heard any of that, Jeff?
So some of that is, it's interesting if we think about this. It has to do with scale. Like in Venezuela and Bolivia, when they rewrote the Constitution, they had to do a constituent assembly because there was no way to get 1/5 of the entire population of the country together. But if you're talking about local, so when they had they created local governing bodies that were communities, and that's where you'd have a people's assembly because it's only 400 families or something that make up a particular, and then it's local issues, but then they live in the same neighborhood. It's easy to get to the same, to get to a meeting, and the logistics are possible and that kind of stuff. So I guess you kind of need both.
Yeah, it seems like that. But they didn't outright say it, but it seems like if you can get the mass, go for it. But if you can't because of numbers, then do the constituent. This seems interesting that they put a number on it to me. Okay. Anyone else?
Hopefully it's benevolent intentions, because like Jeff just said, we get 4 years to choose between Tweedledee and Tweedledum. It's not much of a choice at all. But it's like, did everyone have the choice to come out to participate? They have a real choice to participate in the mass assembly versus the constituency. But I need to look more into the South American countries like that you mentioned. I'm not familiar with that, so it's pretty interesting they're able to do that.
Yeah, later in the chapter, they use the People's Assembly to affect the actual voting, the electoral politics. So kind of interesting there. So let's move on to that. So engaging power, administration of Mayor, I don't know if it's Chokwe Lumumba, but I think that might be it. So this is some of the use of the People's Assembly and other tools that they have there. So our electoral work has had 3 key strategies: mass education, preparatory battles, and operational fronts. The People's Assembly is the primary vehicle of mass education. Our electoral success has been transferring victories from social struggles to the electoral arena. Key to our operational fronts has been the construction of three fronts: United Fronts, Popular Front, and National Liberation Front. So we're going to talk more about the mass education, I think, and the electoral work that they're talking about here. I found these different fronts to be interesting as far as trying to get different, what you could call special interests, addressing. And then what I like about the book is saying there, a lot of it is saying, this is what worked for us, this is what didn't work for us. So let's talk about these different fronts, what they call fronts. So Popular Front, as the big test in the fight against white supremacy, fascist aggression, and other forms of economic and social reaction. It's multi-class, multiracial, multinational, and it addresses very broad issues. And it's the highest level of unity. So this one, what they're calling the Popular Front, is the different types of gatherings that would just be really, really, really broad. It's very much addressing every single kind of issue that happens locally and nationally, really, right? United Front, it's to build social forces in the working class. So this is really class specific: jobs, higher wages, that type of thing. And then the National Liberation Front is a multi-class front of new African or Black forces that concentrate on self-determination for the people of African descent. And this is dealing with the special interests of the people in Jackson specifically, the 80% majority Black that are there. So what's interesting, there's some outcomes that come from these different fronts. It's going to be interesting. And here are some of them. So the process of mass education and instructional struggle is more important than holding office. Instructional struggle must be primary. So this had a whole, couple paragraphs that went along with it, but very interesting for somebody to say, we just said it earlier here, Jeff was saying it, but they're saying education and instruction is more important than actually winning and holding the office. I want to get people's opinion on that.
You gotta teach people how to fish. Oldest one in the book.
Yeah, that is just pretty, politically incorrect to say there are things that are more important than voting, kind of thing, or holding office, not just voting, but holding it. But they go into it, but they had all types of issues. When you're in office, you have all types of blockers, implementing your whatever it is that are part of your plan, and so on and so forth. It's just one part of your struggle. But more important is getting people to understand how to fight, and all of these different tools that they have. Getting them engaged and all that is more important than actually holding office. Very counterintuitive.
My opinion is like, just with how, we've got like how things should work on paper and then how life works. And oftentimes it's not about the paper, but about, popular opinion, whether that's in the news, on social media, and at the workplace, in the lunchroom. And if without the education, that's just so easy to game. And now it's not really even about, popular opinion is determined upon who's winning the contest between, the two political figures. So
yeah,
I'm like, education all the way.
Yeah,
makes it harder.
I think there was a story where they were saying that there was a battle. I don't remember, but I think it was over the water system. Something was going on. There was some system, and when they had control, their opponents were able to put their basically vote against them or work against them, make it to look like they're spending inappropriately or these types of things, and it made it look like they, a lot of people that were on the side of the author, right, of this movement, they failed, right, and so that would be an example of you're holding office. It's easy to attack people that are in office, and take away a bit of their power. But but through the mass education, then power can't really be taken away. It's kind of how I was looking at it. All right, so here's some of the other takeaways. Our practice should be sound as our theory. Key members often did not have the capacity to fully participate in the People's Assembly. And then the United and National Liberation Front must take precedent over the Popular Front. This here, I kind of thought was gonna happen, before I read, because before these descriptions of the different fronts, because the more, it's just basic marketing. The more targeted you are, the more focused you are, the more like kind of power that you have with the people that are on your side. The more diluted you are, and everybody wants to do everything, it creates more bureaucracy, and you're pulled in multiple different ways. You should address things to where you care, morally about everyone, but where you have to make a decision where your resources are going to go. And as far as different initiatives, like if you were to say, oh, we're going to have a gathering for the Popular Front and we're going to have one for United Front and National Liberation Front, they basically said these last two, you should be putting more resources there for those gatherings, for those initiatives, because they have better outcomes. Okay, so, and then it's an interesting statement. Governing in the neoliberal era is a ruling class project of accumulation by dispossession that generates private wealth by plundering public goods on all levels of government. I thought that was a mouthful and quite interesting. This is basically just saying all of it is built-in corruption, private at every step of the way. When you are in office, every private enterprise is trying to push you towards some type of plundering of the public goods. And yeah, that's really what you're fighting against. So anybody have any questions?
It's almost like a very extensive insult. I mean, I could see someone putting that out as a tweet, and most people would be just like, okay, that's a bunch of words versus,
Yeah.
it's corruption, like you say.
Yeah.
Jeff?
Yeah, I'm old enough to have seen, like, I like to tell my students even that the last time the working class ever got a raise was when I graduated from high school in 1979. And we've had neoliberalism ever since, and real wages have been stagnant. And I was listening to a podcast this morning, and they were talking about how Amazon subcontractors who do deliveries now can get fired by algorithms. Like, people can get fired without ever being able to talk to another human being, find out what they did. If the data, when you're like off delivering, and some of the stories they told were like horrific. They couldn't get into the building for some reason. The geolocator noticed that they weren't delivering the package in a timely manner, and they got an email saying they were fired. So I saw this happen in my own school system. We like, I like to say, I want to live in a world that is interdependent and based on trust. I want to work with people I care about and like, but neoliberalism is just the opposite of that. We're all turned into commodities. We don't mean shit. They don't care what happens to us. If we're not making them profit, we can go die as far as they're concerned. There's no loyalty, no commitment, no trust. It's all about profit, plain and simple.
Yeah, that is horrible. It's interesting. The first thing that comes to mind, because I think I've seen that too, the algorithm thing. The first thing that came to mind for me is, what would I rather have? The pointy-haired boss or the algorithm? Right. The assumption is that the middle manager that would be the one that's firing you would be good. Maybe I don't want maybe I do want to be fired by, at least they're both going to exploit me. So maybe I want to be, at least the pointy-haired boss didn't have a job in the first place. if I'm being cynical, but yeah,
Well,
totally.
I feel at least, but the thing is, we don't want either one of those things.
We do not. We have a little enjoyment to know at least that person was never employed, if we're really feeling evil. But yeah, it'd be funny to see if I was Amazon with my evil hat on. My way to defend it would be saying something like that. Would you rather have this person that doesn't do that much work call you up and tell you that you're fired? And then people might say no. Oh my gosh. But yeah, the whole system is messed up. You're correct. I'm forgetting his name, right? Oh, Lydell Hart, a strategist, a war strategist. And one of the things he is known for is a statement, always put your enemies on the horns of a dilemma. And that totally feels like that. Who do you want, the algorithm or the pointy-haired boss? But okay, does anyone else? And we're the ones on the horns of the dilemma. But anyone else?
Just, I guess, one comment on the third one. United Front and National Liberation Front must take precedence over the Popular Front.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was just a quick comment on the National Liberation Front. It's I was doing a bit of looking into that lately, and it's almost like one of those critiques. Something I like about your notes there is the multi-class front of new African or Black forces, because, without that part, it's almost like race reductionist or something like that, and that's kind of one of my largest pet peeves. But when you include the multi-class front, then I think that just fixes everything and put something to it. I think some footsteps can really be taken forward with that. And so I just wanted to just comment, and I like that part of the emphasis on the multi-class front there, because that's normally not brought up with that nationalism part or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, it's important. What is anyone else? All right, let's go to the next section. Kind of the last section. So the cooperation Jackson, the struggle to create economic democracy. So they're talking about cooperatives in this portion. So cooperatives put capital in the service of working people. And here's some components of cooperatives that they listed. So that they're using. So we have democratizing the processes of production, distribution, and consumption, equitability, distributing equitably distributing the surpluses produced or exchanged, creating economies of scale, increasing bargaining power, sharing costs of new technology, gaining access to new markets, reducing individual market risks, and obtaining new services, purchasing in bulk to achieve lower prices, and providing credit under reasonable terms. All of these seem like really good things to keep in mind when you're talking about trying to combat power, redistribute power, and we kind of forget when we think of equitability only, or your right to the fruits of your labor, or something like that. There's lots of other things here that you can use with cooperatives that we got to keep in the front of our mind. Any questions on those? All right. And so another piece in the chapter is the Sustainable Communities Initiative, SCI. It's an array of community-owned cooperative businesses and institutions. They have the Community Land Trust, the Community Development Corporation, the Housing Cooperative, and the Cooperative Education and Training Center. The Land Trust is part of their, let's say, to kind of fit it in with the People's Assembly. The People's Assembly would be the part where you would get together over there, and then they're recognizing that there's a new initiative to do some type of gentrification in Jackson. And one of the things is they got a bunch of FEMA money. The governor got a bunch of FEMA money, and they're using it to put in institutions or different, projects in the city that don't serve the people that live there, things that they would not use. So it's to draw people who are not there to come there, and to drive the people that are there out by doing different things. We talked about this last talk, but raising the property taxes, so on and so forth. So community land trust it would be used to go ahead and purchase. So, okay, let me step back. The People's Assembly would be where that mass education that we're talking about, that's when people would learn about, this new project is happening. They're trying to move us out. What are we going to do? And then the people, wait a minute, why not have that? Well, this is why you might not want to have to. So this is the mass education portion, and you're deliberating, right? Then after that, you have a cooperative that you can say, well, let's buy a piece of land that's right in the middle of where they're going and just mess all their project up, and we're gonna have a cooperative own it. And they didn't say this in there, but there's things you can do where you say, okay, the major owner in the cooperative is a trust, and written into the trust, it has a rule that says you can't sell this property no matter what. You can't sell it. And you can put something like you can't sell it ever, or you can put something in there that says you can't sell it unless the majority, every last person in this area says yes, or something like that, to make it really hard to sell, so that people can't be bought out, and then get gentrified, right? So that the community land trust and cooperatives is kind of the tool, and then the People's Assembly is the education process, where you're making the decisions before that. Jeff?
Yeah, the reason, I mean, it's kind of interesting. This is, as we think about how to really solve our problems, the housing that you live on, it's like kind of a multi-stakeholder cooperative is the thing. You want the land to belong to the community so that you can decommodify housing. Mm-hmm. So right now, the problem for us, I mean, you can't afford to live, at least where I am near DC, housing is completely unaffordable to regular people. And it's gotten crazy. And it's because housing is a commodity. It shouldn't be a commodity. We need housing to live as part of the basic food, clothing, shelter. We need that stuff to live. So how do you solve that problem? And there are other places in the world, actually, even since 1919, in Vienna, Austria, 60% of all housing is owned by the city of Vienna. Mm-hmm. And so there are all these models that they're experimenting with, and part of it is the community owns the land, and then the cooperative owns the buildings on top of it. That means you have democratic control over the plumbing and the resources and all that, but you can't just sell it for whatever you want because you don't own the land.
Right. Yeah, and you can't. Yeah, it makes sense. I guess you may have seen or heard of the Blackrock, the company coming through, and they're the ones, we're in Austin, but it's all over the country. They're the ones going through and buying everyone, raising the property values because they're trying to buy the homes. And so you have homes, one of the stories I've seen, like homes in Austin are literally like $100,000 worth more than probably what they should be, because BlackRock is buying them, right? A hedge fund is coming through and buying the homes and trying to make people into renters instead of owners, right? So there's some threshold after it passes that it'll be like DC, basically, but I don't know what the ownership is like in DC, but in these other places that are growing really, really fast, it's, I have a house and I get all these letters that look like they're fake, handwritten by, it looks like an individual, and it's BlackRock. It's basically a hedge fund trying to buy your house. So
wow.
Yeah, I mean, look at BlackRock and home buying. It was in the New York Times and stuff. So it's pretty nasty.
I get those weekly, Watson.
Yeah.
They annoy me.
Yeah. So yeah, we're ready to go back to feudalism, basically. All right. Anyone else? This cooperative education training center is something that I want to look into and see what things are they doing over there. So it's very, very interesting. And we tried to reach out. I tried to reach out on LinkedIn, but I didn't get any response from some people that are in it wasn't the author, it was Cooperatives in Jackson in general. And someone was going to say something.
Yeah, no, I was just saying, I think, when that BlackRock stuff came out, I had to delete a few Instagram comments I was going to make, and people were celebrating it, saying, I wish I could be like them. I'm like, and I just, it's it's insane. But I think that's where the education piece comes from.
Yeah.
The mass education, like they even worse from what you're saying. I forget the name. I think Conroe, maybe. That's in Louisiana. It's some suburb in between here in Austin and Houston. They bought a neighborhood with, I think it was like over 100 something homes where they're going to be permanent. They're going to permanently short-term lease them. And so, I mean, that's just wiping out the opportunity for ownership, which is what builds the primary wealth builder for a whole region.
Yeah.
And so it's crazy. So yeah, I like the education, and you're right on it now with the cooperative education.
Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah, I think these people's assemblies, trying to bring it back to software, there are, different organizations we work with, and they have different things where they'll name something a special interest group or a working group, and the other types of groups. And as far as doing governance, and I think there's, parallels here with the people's assemblies. And then, but what's interesting is, as far as the governance portion, you have the parallels. But as far as the execution and the ownership, right, all of the labor and the fruits of the labor and all that, it's empty in some of the, like, our open source development and those types of things. Like, how it's kind of, I won't say it's empty, but it's a little bit more shallow as far as how it goes, ownership rights and so on and so forth. So it's basically, you don't need to worry about all of that. Things will just work itself out. Nobody will exploit each other. Just put all the ownership in this organization, kind of thing. So yeah. General, ideas or thoughts about the this chapter and People's Assembly. Anybody have some things to wrap up? Comments?
These guys are badass.
I think so.
Yeah, I wish we could keep trying to reach out to them. I mean, even take a trip there sometime. I mean, this is the kind of thing I'd like to learn from what they're doing. It's a very ambitious project.
I would totally, I don't like traveling. I would totally like to go here and see what they're doing. I mean, even if it's just ends up being it's a bunch of farmers, I don't know. I would totally like to go be there. And, it's very ambitious. So I'm very
It's in practice,
surprised.
though.
Yeah, it's in practice.
And that's what I like. That's what I like is,
Yeah.
I'd like to see look at what they're doing and then see what other companies, especially on, I guess, the tech side. The one that comes to mind for me would be Inspiral, which has they have a dev academy and for learning and other things. But to see how far that goes, and probably look at some other groups as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
go ahead.
I'm sorry.
No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, is it okay to put in a plug for another webinar?
Sure.
What I'm working with Mickey Metz from Agaric and a group of other folks. We want, is Volk a member of the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops?
No.
So we're trying to, Argentina is way ahead of us in the U.S. also. They have this thing called FACTIC and FIT. And what they do is basically it's principle 6 of cooperativism, cooperation among cooperatives. So they even help nurture. They share information. They even share what kind of prices they charge, so that they can end up cooperating instead of competing. And I mean, they have a much better relationship with the national government than we would have here also, but they're able through their federation to take on larger jobs, even though they have like this network of co-ops all across the country. And if a larger job comes in, they can combine cooperators from different cooperatives to work on a given job. And they help new co-ops. They try to nurture them and help them grow. They find work for them. They give them training. So we've been trying, well, Agaric's been doing this for a long time. Nova Web Development has been just a late comer to this, so I've been working with Mickey, and we're trying to form the same kind of federation in the U.S.
Sounds like a good idea. We were going to make this talk about value chains, cooperative value chains, which was a topic in the book. And it's basically what you're saying, like people, cooperative of cooperatives, and how it is that you need to, fill in the blanks with different cooperatives. Yeah, it's something that we're interested in.
So Agaric has their weekly show and tell at 3:00 on Thursdays. The July 29th one is going to be this cooperator from Argentina who's going to talk to us about that.
It sounds good. I'll probably join that. I'll get the information from you.